Okay, I want to join Charles's comments yesterday by acknowledging the Anishinaabe territory on which we have been welcomed today. And I don't see the chief in the room today, but really appreciated the warm welcome that the chief of Atikamekw extended to us yesterday for our conference. So I want to acknowledge that and the fact that it is through that sharing of knowledge, the willingness of First Nation communities to share knowledge with us, that we, those of us who like myself, come from European ancestry, that we survived in this climate and in this place and learned how to adapt here, and that we've been privileged by that. I also want to extend the regrets of Jessica Najwan-Smith from the Ontario Native Welfare Administrators Association. She can't be with us today because she's in the midst of the fall assembly of her association in Toronto. But she's been very kind in sharing with me a lot of the on-the-ground experience that she's had in terms of the organizational experience of delivering Ontario Works and social assistance in First Nation communities. I also want to acknowledge that for the last, it's almost 10 years now that I've been engaged with the Ontario Native Welfare Administrators Association. And I've had an opportunity to learn a great deal from that organization because the people on the front lines who are administering social assistance in First Nation communities certainly know an awful lot more about their communities than I will ever know. And I've worked with them to develop a training program that meets their learning needs. And this has been a real privilege, and one of the things that I think I'm most proud of in terms of my work as an academic is actually developing courses that respond to real community needs and that provide them with the kind of training that they want and that they see as useful to themselves. I also, just before I move on to my own presentation, I seem to be extending a lot of thank yous and to others, but this conference has been, I think, a really wonderful, provided a really wonderful selection of perspectives on guaranteed annual income or BIG, the basic income guarantee. And so thank you, Charles, for coordinating this, leading the charge on this, and to all of the staff at the Northern Policy Institute for bringing this conference together. I wish that everybody across Northern Ontario was able to be present in the room with us. I know quite a number have joined us via live feed, but there's always something special that happens when you're in the room. So I want to thank you for that, and for the speakers that took the time to really not only share their research with us, but also really to think about how it could impact in this region. I think that it's been very useful and has really informed certainly my thinking. So I did some changes to my presentation last night based on what some of the folks said yesterday, but I wasn't able to capture the speakers this morning, so I'm going to address that perhaps as I go through this. This quote comes from a young man who led the Students' Union at the University of Saskatchewan for 2 years, from 2012 to 2014, Max Fine-Day. He's an up-and-coming leader I think, recognized by First Nations nationally as somebody to watch in terms of bringing some real cultural rootedness to his observations, as well as a very strong political analysis to what he's doing. And he's suggesting that the idea of a basic income guarantee is one that should be very seriously considered by First Nation communities. And so why today am I extending a lot of cautions to you about this? I think we do need to really seriously consider it, but I think the speakers in the last couple of days have really emphasized some of the areas that we also really need to pay attention to. It's not only the content of a basic income guarantee, but also it's the process of how it's delivered, the process of how it's applied within communities, and also the actual amounts. I think Mike's comments yesterday about how much money is actually going to be invested is also a crucial one, because we're not likely to see all the benefits unless the benefit level is one that is really brings a substantial difference to people's lives. So these are some of the benefits before today's presentation that I had garnered from the research that I've done and from listening to the speakers yesterday. And so there's really these four potential benefits. Certainly reducing poverty, and as a result improving health was one of the main things that came out of, I think, the presentations by both Evelyn and Valerie. Valerie spoke extremely eloquently to food insecurity and what kind of an impact that could make on health if we could address that one piece of the poverty thing. And I think that Evelyn's research that looked at this one example that we have, one Canadian example of administration, was also very valuable in identifying these potential benefits that could come, both the health benefits as well as the educational benefits that may result from keeping people in school longer. So those are that in and of itself is a tremendous potential benefit. Improving the life for low-income and precarious workers. We know the global trend is raising this kind of employment across internationally as well as nationally and across all regions of the province. So again, another tremendous potential benefit of the basic income guarantee. Reducing the stigma attached to the receipt of social assistance was another one that previous speakers have raised, and one that is particularly one that we want to reflect on in terms of First Nations and how things may be a little bit different within First Nation communities within the administration of social assistance. And finally, although Michael pointed out to us that there's not a lot of dollars actually saved in administration, although $133 million still sounds like a big number to me, but doesn't translate into very much more money into the pockets of all of the low-income people that we have across the province. So saving those administration dollars is one of the ways that, or one of the potential benefits that we hear a lot about. And in some research that I found in Brazil, there was real interest in this as a potential benefit, and in particular in the elimination of what they called the poverty industry. So those are some of the key potential benefits, as well as now a new one that we need to add to this mix of that kind of goes along, I suppose, with improving the life for low-income workers, but also perhaps improving the opportunities for the types of employment, not just their income, that they might be participating in. So why is it that I think that we should be, all of us, all of the treaty peoples, should be considering very carefully introduction of this in First Nation communities, and together with some of the folks at UNWA, what we've identified is sort of 4 questions or cautions about the introduction that any kind of a pilot project would need to address. So the questions are: First Nation communities differ substantially from other communities, and I'm going to show you a slide on that in a moment, or a few slides on that, but differ substantially from municipalities and rural communities where we have DSABs. So are all of those benefits that we might realize in a municipality, for example, are they all going to translate into a program that's delivered in a First Nation? Our second question is, will eliminating the local administration really benefit First Nation communities? And I think that's again, a very serious question that we need to address. Some of the other questions that were raised, I suppose, by Michael's presentation and also is just, are those savings that are realized, if savings are realized, are those savings going to be reinvested back into First Nation communities? So if we take money out of administration, is that money going to be replaced and put into other programs? I think that's a very big question for First Nation communities. And another thing that we have to look at is that funding rates for programs that are delivered in First Nation communities have, in quite a number of cases, been lower than for other communities. Sorry, I think have historically been lower in other communities, in communities other than First Nation. So, we need to ask the question, is this program going to be different? If we're going to pilot this, how are we going to make sure that this time the same percentage rates are administered or delivered in First Nation communities? So this is like a really brief snapshot of First Nation communities in Ontario, and I want to emphasize, of course, I'm looking at the poverty positions, or some of the things that are contributing to the experience of poverty in First Nation communities. So this isn't all of the incredibly wonderful things that First Nation communities are doing. I'm instead looking at the flip side. What is happening that a low-income program such as this might be able to address? So here's the First Nation communities in Ontario. As you can see, and distinctly different from one that might show municipalities across the province, there's a lot that are clustered in Northern Ontario. And in fact, most of the First Nation communities are in Northern Ontario, a substantial number, and some bigger in size in Southern Ontario. But we see that they're dominantly in Northern Ontario, particularly as Northern Ontario has been redefined a few times over the last 20 years or so. So there's 133 First Nations across the province, and there's quite a substantial number that have less than 500 people. So many of the communities are quite small. Some are quite large. There's some are remote, some are fly-in communities, and then there's also some that are quite close to urban centers. So we see that there's quite a range of communities. There's not one community that represents or can represent every First Nation across the province. And of course, the culture, the history, the context, the treaty that governs the First Nations' access to resources and so on differ substantially from one community to another. Now this is from the 2001 census, because it's very difficult to get a collection of pieces of information about First Nations that are really reflective, but I think this gives you, again, a bit of a snapshot of some of the very substantial differences that First Nations experience in terms of the likelihood of poverty. So 84% more Aboriginal lone parent families, 14% fewer graduate, and I should stress that this is nationally. Okay, so this includes everybody. This is all status individuals across Canada, and anyone who is self-identified as an Aboriginal person. So that could be Métis status, Inuit, non-status people. 68% fewer Aboriginal people earned a university degree. I know those of us who teach in universities are seeing some change in that, certainly some improvements, but still very substantially lower than the general population. 145% more unemployed than in the general population. The average individual income for Aboriginal peoples in Ontario was $11,000 less than other Ontarians, and there were 48% more Aboriginal people that were considered low income. And I would suggest to you that in First Nation communities, and I see quite a number of people that can speak to this better than I can, but I would suggest that for Aboriginal people living in First Nation communities, that last number is probably higher than 48%. A few more facts, things that we don't consider, but I think need to be considered in light of the questions about health impacts. So in 2014, over half of the First Nations in Ontario were under boil water advisories, and 10 of those for longer than 10 years. 41.5% of homes on reserve required repairs, compared to 7% in non-Aboriginal communities. Funding for children's benefits, I mentioned that the rates were lower, 7% lower, and life expectancy is substantially lower. So we see that there's a collection of things that make the face of poverty look a bit different in First Nation communities than in non-Aboriginal communities. And so we have to question, in terms of research and so on, can that research apply? And I would certainly suggest to you, and I think most of us in the room would say, no, if we're going to be looking at a guaranteed annual income in First Nation communities, if First Nation communities want to proceed with that, definitely the research needs to be done in a First Nation community about whether that is a good idea, whether it works, whether the same kinds of benefits are being realized there as in other communities. In Northern Ontario itself, we see that Aboriginal communities have a much higher youth population, and that youth outmigration is lower than for other Northern Ontario communities. So that's a really important thing. This is where our future leaders may be coming from, not only for the First Nation communities themselves, but for all of Northern Ontario. We may be looking forward to having an increasing number of Northern Ontario leaders of all communities coming from Aboriginal ancestry. The labour force participation rates and employment rates for Aboriginal communities are lower than for the region as a whole, and the unemployment rates for Aboriginal communities are consistently higher than for the region as a whole. Again, these are just more information about this, educational levels, goes on and on. Sort of almost every kind of social indicator that we have, we see that First Nation communities experience those, and not surprisingly, I mean, if you pay less for education, you invest less in children, and you invest less in programs overall, it's not surprising that then the outcomes are going to be more challenging as well. So my next, I guess, I feel like I've addressed that first question. Are those potential benefits going to transfer? Well, we really don't know. And I think that we really need to look very carefully at that. So that's a caution in terms of policy making. The next question is, will eliminating administration costs benefit First Nations? Now, most of us are really enthusiastic when more dollars gets into the hands of the individual person who is on a low income, and I certainly am. I'm always happy to see that. I worked as an advocate for 15 years on behalf of low-income people, and I was constantly trying to get more money into the hands of the people who are coming in the door. But First Nation communities have been doing some very interesting things in their delivery of social assistance that I think other communities can definitely learn from. So First Nation communities are addressing this as a program of first response rather than the last resort. And that is a complete and total mind shift from the stigma that we see attached in non-First Nation communities. Mike Nadeau, who used to be the executive director of the Ontario Native Welfare Administrators Association, is now the CAO of the Sault Ste. Marie Social Services Board. And what he says is that First Nations have it right. They have eliminated that stigma in their delivery, that they treat people coming in the door with dignity and respect. And it's not the same experience. And that has a tremendous influence on the community members who are seeking assistance at the Social Assistance Office. And some of that is that they wind up delivering a lot more services than most social assistance offices. They're not a place where people just get a check. This is a 211 website of a First Nation in Northwestern Ontario. These are the kinds of services that community delivers. So you can see that there's just a wide range of services, and this certainly doesn't include all of the ones. Each community has responded to the needs in its own community. But when people come in the door, the first question is not, do you have your birth certificate and the birth certificate of all your children, and do you have all this documentation that you need in order to qualify? The first question is, what's happened and what can we do to help? And so they're a first place of referral service sometimes to addiction, mental health services. It might be, employment, pre-employment training programs that some of the communities deliver. Some of those are rooted in cultural teachings, so they're culturally appropriate services that are being delivered. And so it's kind of that 360-degree service, the wraparound services that most non-Aboriginal communities dream about providing the progressive social activists in other communities. So services here range from funeral services through to personal support workers, through to, you name it, it's there. Additionally, these are some things that the social service workers themselves have done over the last few years to try to improve their services. So they introduced a training program that I was quite privileged to be a part of. And since that time, the Ministry of Community and Social Services has identified a 70% improvement in administration since the training began. Now, why is that important? Because we have 133 First Nations. Some of them have as many as 20-some people working in their social services delivery department. They are professionals who've been highly trained. They're taking university courses to help them in their work. They're delivering that in a very cost-effective way. They're learning about how to administer a program and both the legal and the financial end of it, as well as other skills in working in the community, including a component on social entrepreneurship. You'll be interested as part of that training program. So those professionals are not just staying, and this is anecdotal at this stage. I don't have firm numbers on this. But of course, many of those professionals are also working, they move on and work in other departments within the community. So they're really building the human capacity, the human capital that they have within those communities in that particular program. So those things are not to be sort of ignored. The other thing is that with First Nation communities, because of the very, very high unemployment levels, even 3 jobs in a community that has, say, 250 people, 3 jobs are very, very important to the economics of that community. That is 3 families that are living on a decent income and that are probably sharing that much more broadly within their community. So again, doing a good cost-benefit analysis of the administration and what's going to happen to that administration would be a very important component, I think, of any kind of introduction of this. One of the other studies that I took a look at was a study from Brazil, which was very interesting, where Sao Paulo decided to introduce a guaranteed income, whatever they call it, and what they wanted to do was eliminate, quote unquote, the poverty industry. The poverty industry was considered to be a lot of nonprofits who advocated on behalf of low-income people. And one of the findings from that research was that in fact, it was really organized in a way, the introduction of that program was really organized in a way that it silenced the advocates, so that the advocates could no longer advocate on behalf of low-income people, and that low-income people were therefore having to deal with government one-on-one, that there was no longer an organization that could support them and take a look at it. So, you know, again, a caution: if these essential services are removed from First Nation communities, how will they be delivered? Will there really be a cost savings in it? Will the money saved be reinvested in First Nation communities? So we have a very long history of a lack of consultation. Yesterday, I think it was Pam at my table was saying, you know, in 1965, no consultation with First Nations, when the federal government moved to a federal-provincial split in cost sharing. 1995, when Mike Harris brought in the cuts and brought in Ontario Works, again, no consultation. That resulted in a court battle that took a very long time to resolve. And some communities still do not implement all of the Ontario Works components of things because they felt it did not fit with their communities. We have a situation, the Deputy Minister on Tuesday announced at ONWA's Fall Assembly that the consultation was going to begin sometime before Christmas in November, maybe, and would end in June of next year, and then the pilots would be announced sometime after that, or the pilot, a pilot, or the pilot, or pilots, or whatever. To date, the Ontario Native Welfare Administrators Association has not received any invitation to participate in those consultations. They have not received, they receive things as they're released to the general public. So a real lack of respect, I think, for the people who are delivering the service, but also perhaps a lack of awareness on the part of the ministry of just how important this may be to First Nation communities. You know, as Eric Hoskins, the Minister of Health, indicated when he announced he announced $222 million to address some of the health inequities in First Nation communities. Again, what we saw yesterday is that I think the cost of administration was deemed to be about $300 million, and that was going to result in, what was it, $115 per person across the province annually, if that was the amount of money that was reinvested or something like that. Or no, that was $1 billion, I think that was. So we see that $220 million is not a lot to invest to address social inequities. However, there is some willingness on the part of the government, obviously indicated by this, that they do want to address those inequities. But we're still living in an era where the child benefit, which has been built along the lines of a basic income guarantee, and it's considered one of the most effective programs in Canada, is still being delivered at a lower rate on First Nation communities than it is. The rates are lower, 7% lower than they are elsewhere. And the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal found that the provincial government was in breach, that the federal government was in breach, but they still haven't complied with it. So this is 2 years now that they have not complied with the order by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to address this inequity. So we see that, you know, these inequities are things that really, so I come back to these first four questions that I raised about the cautions for the design of the program, the delivery. This is about the process of the delivery. I think that there was pretty general consensus in the room that we would be a lot better off if we could raise people's level of income to, say, $30,000 per year. It would certainly increase social assistance rates. It would provide some kind of security for precarious and low-income workers. But you know, that might be the content that we're aiming for. We also talked about incremental stages. But I guess some of my questions are will those incremental stages really address the differences in First Nation communities, or will it be a policy that's just administered across the province, as is usually the case, with very little accommodation and very little recognition for the particular face of poverty in First Nation communities? Thanks very much.